Hello, and welcome to episode number 2 of the National Land Realty podcast, where we discuss all things land. Our goal is to inform, educate, and entertain those of you who own land or are interested in the buying and selling of land throughout the United States. My name is Mac Christian, and I am the Chief Marketing Officer here at National Land Realty. I'll be your host for this episode. Today, our topic will be what to know about mineral rights with land professional Keith Morris out of Oxford, Mississippi. This discussion is based on What to Know About Mineral Rights, written by Keith Morris and published on our blog at nationalland.com. Prior to working with National Land Realty, Keith worked for Shell Oil for over 30 years and is now a professor at Ole Miss University teaching business management and negotiation in addition to working as a land agent for National Land Realty. This makes him a premier source of information regarding mineral rights and land use. Now, sit back and enjoy the show. All right, so this is Mac Christian here with National Land Realty, and I'm sitting here with Keith Morris, who is a land professional out of Mississippi. Now, Keith has a unique sort of stable of information in his head here that he's acquired over 37 years with Shell Oil, and now is a professor at Ole Miss and also a land professional with us, and it gives him a unique insight for the topic we're here to discuss, which is mineral rights on properties, either from a buyer perspective or a seller's perspective, things to keep in mind to protect you. So, Keith, I want to give you a chance here. Tell us a little bit about your background. How did you get here? And what have you done for the last 37 years that, I find it very interesting. So I'd rather you tell it.
Well, 37 years, I mean, it's like, where's the time gone? It's just flown by. I can hardly imagine. Mac, I am originally from a small town in southwest Mississippi, Woodville, Mississippi. Went to college there at Southern Miss, graduated, and I interviewed with Shell. I actually was a real estate agent at the time. Interviewed with Shell and started as a petroleum landman. And they put me directly in the field buying oil and gas leases in Arkansas and Mississippi, later Michigan, and worked there in the field. Then went into the office and did what we call farm outs and farm ins, where you're trading oil and gas lease interest around. And then amazingly, they sent me into international. I didn't even have a passport. I didn't even know how to get a passport, and went into international and negotiated some contracts for Shell and mostly in Latin America, but also in the Middle East, Asia. And then was a land manager for the U.S. activities at one time, then went back to working in Latin America. And in the middle of the pandemic, they asked me how long I was going to work, and I told them, well, forever, And then they offered me a separation package, and I accepted that. And then reacquired my license and went to work for National Land and teach at Ole Miss Business. So, I'm kind of deciding that retirement doesn't fit well with me. I don't know. We'll see.
Yeah, you seem to be keeping yourself pretty busy. And then just to keep this in perspective, so like when we're talking about mineral rights on properties or a lease or from a buyer's perspective or a seller's perspective, you worked on the side of looking at these contracts. I mean, essentially, when you're talking about mineral rights on a property, you've done this for 37 years. Looked at contracts that people have for their land and understood that, bought and sold those, and worked with landowners on these kind of things, right?
Yeah. So, in the U.S., contrary to international, in the international realm, mostly the governments own the mineral interest. The U.S., private citizens own the minerals. A lot of people don't really understand that, but it was patented out of the U.S. government. They gave all right, title, and interest. Whatever the government owned, the people acquired, particularly when they're settling the West. Remember, they gave land grants.
You're going to say that probably drove the wildcatter boom, right?
Yeah. And so the minerals are out of the government for the most part. Of course, the government owns a lot of land still in the U.S., but that which was patented out is owned by the citizens, and it's a property interest. I don't think a lot of people fully appreciate that. It's a property interest. And when you convey a property to someone else, you can convey everything you own, or you can convey everything you own with certain reservations. And mineral interest are one of those. And so what a petroleum landman does is they go into the courthouse and they check property records, generally back to probably when they realized the first well was drilled, maybe earlier. And then they run it forward from grantor to grantee and see if there's any reservations. If there are no reservations of minerals, the surface owner will own the minerals. If there are prior reservations, then there's a split of the mineral interest, right? And so you would have to negotiate with more parties for an oil and gas lease to cover that. And it's very rare that someone turns you down when you knock on their door because they don't even know they own the minerals, right? And you're there to buy oil and gas leases.
Just to, like, I guess to throw it out into more simple terms. So what you're saying is just because you own a piece of land, that dictates that you own surface rights. You own everything above the ground. Depending on the state, you can own, high water line, or you can own what's under the water, depending on the
every state has different laws.
Every state, and that's what makes it so fun to go from state to state, especially if you do a lot of fly fishing like I do. But with that, just because you own the surface does not necessarily mean that you own what is below your own ground, even if it's oil.
That's right. Most people don't really appreciate that. They will, someone will agree to convey to you all their right, title, and interest in a property. And your presumption is that I have it all, right? I have all of your right, title, and interest. But you can't convey something you don't own, which would have been something that would have been reserved in prior title before you acquired it, right? So if that happened, there was a prior reservation. And so you would have whatever the seller owned, but you can't, of course, they can't convey something they don't own themselves. So you would only own that, and it'd be subject to prior reservations. When you get in some states where there's been a lot of oil and gas activity, you're going to find a lot more reservations than if you go to a state where there's been no oil and gas activity. It's not at the forefront of someone's mind to reserve minerals, right? So you'll find lesser of those activities. But it's a very interesting process. It takes time. It's if you're into research and you kind of solving puzzles, you very much enjoy checking the titles. Sometimes it can be pretty quick and easy. Sometimes it can be quite complex. And then you go meet with the mineral owners and try to negotiate oil and gas leases. And you meet everyone. I mean, I have leased federal judges. I have leased people that worked in, blue collar jobs, all through the economic spectrum. They're all wonderful. You never know what challenges you're going to have. You have to, explain what you'd like to achieve, what you're hoping to conduct. But generally speaking, it is good money for a landowner that they would not have otherwise received. So you're generally a well received. I don't think anybody slams the door on the publisher's clearinghouse sweepstakes guy that shows up. and not too many people are frustrated when the oil and gas company shows up at their door.
I was going to say, so how it works is you make contact with the landowner, and this is given that you haven't seen any reservations, which so right. Basically, and I want to walk back through that. So language wise, so when you're saying that there can be reservations on a property, what that means is somebody has said basically, if something is here, then I have rights to it. Well,
they'll convey you all of their right, title, and interest, reserving unto themselves and their successors and assigns maybe 1/2 of the mineral interest. If they owned 100% of the interest today, then you would own all of the surface and half the minerals, and the prior owner would own half the minerals.
Okay.
And it's held in perpetuity, except in some states like Louisiana, where absent activity, it reverts to the surface owner. But generally speaking, it is held in perpetuity. So it's interest that can proceed for your family forever, right? And you can trade and sell mineral interest just like you do the surface. It's done every day.
So how would you, is that usually in the contract? So when you go to buy a piece of land, like, so if I'm a prospective buyer and I sort of start going through the contract and the land rights, is it going to be in there specifically, or do you sort of need to watch out for anything? Do you need to be watching for reserved rights? And then you have to, so as you were talking about doing your homework back to the original landowner, is that a situation where you have to sort of do your homework?
Well, most people are not going to know that own the land today whether they own the minerals. They're going to think they own the minerals, but they're actually not going to know. When you went to closing on the property, you got a title certificate or a title check. That title check generally was, does the person that owned the land, purports to own the land, actually own it? Are they selling you what they own? It's not an abstract of title that goes all the way back, generally speaking, to check mineral interest, right? So they're conveying what they own. You're making sure you have marketable title or good title to the property that you're acquiring. It's when there's oil and gas activity, you start realizing, well, maybe I didn't get all the minerals, right? And the person that sold them to you was acting in good faith when they sold the property. They didn't own them themselves. They didn't know.
Or they didn't know, right?
They didn't know themselves, right? So that's what I'm saying. It's very mysterious, and then people, get concerned and whatnot. But generally speaking, when you convey property it'll be what you're speaking to will be addressed in the land purchase contract. Some forms has it a check where you convey all, half, some. You'll check. Other forms will not say anything, and if you're conveying all your right, title, and interest, you're conveying everything you own, whatever that may be. And so you're conveying minerals. So unless there is a reservation, there is a conveyance. That's the important mindset. Yes.
So if you were a landowner and you wanted to find out if you own any mineral rights or if you own half or anything like that, what process would you go through?
Well, I tell people ask me this question from time to time, and I tell them, if you're kind of interested in research and you're kind of interested in land related matters, you can learn a lot of this on your own. You go to the property record room in the courthouse in which your land is situated, and it'll be organized in a number of ways. Some will have what they call a section index, which will list all of the conveyances in that section. That's easier. You can go back through all the way back. Maybe you could start it in 1900 to present, and it might be 7, 8 conveyances if it's in a rural property, more if you're closer to a city. Generally, every generation or two will transfer it. And you can see if there's any reservations as you pull the books. You'll have a book and page against the wall, typically. You can pull those books and see if there's a prior reservation of minerals. If you do not see a prior reservation, then all right, title, and interest conveyed from grantor to grantee as you went through the chain of title, right? That's basically it. You can hire an attorney to do this for you. Probably wouldn't be that expensive because if it's a local attorney, they know that record room very well, and they can probably do it in an hour or two. Very reasonable. So, you have two ways. You can do it on your own or you can hire someone to do it. I encourage people to do it on their own because it's kind of interesting to see the history of your property, which families may have owned it in the past. Maybe some of their relatives. So it's kind of interesting to do the history, just like, you do your ancestry for yourself. Look at the piece of property, who owned it in the past. I find that always very interesting.
Yeah, and I was going to ask, so and I just, mostly because I don't know how it works, it seems like, so could you potentially have a reservation in the title? So somebody says, I'm selling this to you, but I'm retaining half of the mineral rights. Mm-hmm. And then on the next sale, so, next buyer gets it, they can do a full conveyance of everything that they own, rights and title. But since they didn't own 100%, they're still selling everything they have.
Yeah, everything.
But you wouldn't see that reservation that was there before, right?
That conveyance would be subject to prior reservations.
Okay.
So you're protecting the prior reservation. But yes, the buyer gets everything subject to whatever is in the back titles, we say.
So you really do have to go all the way back to find which reservations were there.
Yeah. Technically speaking, you have to go all the way back to patent.
Okay.
That came out of the U.S. government. But if you're looking for oil and gas, the first well was drilled, late 1800s. So you can say, okay, well, I'll start around 1900, run it forward. That's dangerous. No person in title is going to tell you, well, don't go back to patent. I'm just kind of giving you a practical approach. It's going to be very location dependent, whether you're in a place that had a lot of oil and gas activity or not, But people didn't think about the mineral interest until they realized there was value there, right? And then they said, okay, well, I kind of would like to keep some mineral interest. So they would hold it and reserve half. or a fourth, and then let everything else convey. And, finding some of those heirs can be quite problematic because they don't know that they own minerals either. That went back a couple of generations, maybe. So it's kind of like I say, it's kind of like being a detective sometimes. It's quite interesting.
It sounds like being a detective most of the time if you're really interested in this, especially if you're looking at buying property again to where like you can buy something and it has a conveyance of, even if it stipulates that you're taking into account all prior reservations, you still want to go back and address exactly what those reservations are all the way back to patent in case, there's not even a full understanding from the current landowner.
Yeah. Right? So you might would want to understand, for example, easements. If there are prior easements, a right of way, surface use restrictions. I mean, we're speaking about minerals, but there's a lot of things that could be out there, none of which would probably impair the transfer of the property, but you're buying it subject to those prior encumbrances on the land. And it's just good to know those. I mean, personally, when I buy land, you can imagine, I run it all the way back, back to patent. So I know when I am buying property, what's out there. And of course, I still hire an attorney to do a record title. They tell me I'm not licensed to practice law, and everybody laughs, but I do run the title myself and make sure I know what I'm buying. I mean, it's no different than anything else. I encourage landowners to go and look, just understand the process, and you might really enjoy it, and just run your property back and see who owned it and what you may own in terms of minerals and so forth. It's quite interesting process.
What's situationally, especially from a land professional perspective, have you run into any situations where this has been an issue as far as like, somebody coming in trying to buy a property, finding out either that they own a lot or that they own very little?
Well, it's interesting. When you buy property, you have a reason for buying it. You're looking for recreational property. You're buying it for timberland. You're buying it for pasture, cattle. You're buying it for some use, home sites. They're not thinking in terms of minerals. They're not thinking in those terms. So generally speaking, when I'm representing a seller, I ask them, do you want to reserve some of the minerals? Some of them are indifferent, not really interested in that. Some immediately say, well, yes. I said, okay, why don't we reserve half? And then, of course, you got some landowners say, I want it all. I didn't think about it. I want it all, And I've done some of all of those three in the transactions I have worked on, but I generally will raise it and ask them if that's important to them. Buyers tend to be less focused on that because they're not buying it for the minerals.
That wasn't the intent when they went in, right?
It wasn't the intent, right? So they will see the contract. If the seller reserves half, that's okay. If the seller reserves all, that might be okay. If there's a seller reserving nothing, that's fine too. They're not buying it with that being in the stream of consciousness as to the basis for buying it. Now, when I buy property, you can imagine that's going to be on the checklist of the things to negotiate. And, generally speaking, it's fair for the seller to reserve some minerals, but it is certainly fair for the buyer to receive some minerals because if there's oil and gas activity on the land, they want to participate in the benefits of that. So,
and you also stated and make sure I'm understanding, you'd previously written an article about this and I wanted to make sure I understood it.
Yeah.
So part of the reason for this is so that people cannot inhibit the ability to withdraw minerals from a given piece of land. So you could potentially own the land and the person who owns the mineral rights could harvest from that land regardless, correct?
Well, generally in most states, the mineral servitude, the mineral estate, is of a higher priority than the surface estate.
Right.
And at first you think, well, that's kind of odd, right? That's kind of odd. But if you think about it, which surface owner that doesn't have any minerals is going to be supportive of the equipment coming on, drilling of wells and whatnot, and get no benefit out of it. So, you could hamper or impair the rights of another co-owner in the property, which is the mineral estate, right? So most courts, I'm not an attorney, most courts, as I understand, do provide priority to the mineral estate, and they recognize that that is of importance. So, and then, as I say, if I'm in representing a client, as a seller or the buyer, I mention this, put it out on the table. The buyer is going to want to get some economic benefit in the land that they're acquiring, and that's very reasonable. And it's also reasonable for the seller to say, listen, I want to retain some interest in this in case something happens. So it's part of the negotiation. If neither one are interested, then it just goes forward. And that, interestingly, is, in my experience, is about half the times, neither party is really interested in it.
Which is fun. And just knowing how it's viewed from an industry perspective, I find that fascinating that you can buy, let's say a large piece of land and you still didn't buy the most valuable part of it. Like the fact that the below ground rights are often seen as more valuable and given priority in an exchange. I just think that's fascinating. So that's something that you would definitely say any person who owns or is looking to buy or looking to sell land, this is something that everybody should probably look into.
Well, you just want to make it part of the deal. It's all factored into the price and the competition for the property, and it's all part of the deal negotiations. The minerals are not going to be worth anything if there's no well drilled and there's no production. Most oil and gas wells that are drilled are dry. Most people think there's a super high success rate. There's not, honestly. And so most wells are going to be dry. So, but if it is good, you're exactly right. It's most likely going to be the most valuable aspect of that land, particularly if it's a lot of accumulation of oil there or gas, could be very valuable. It's part of the negotiation is what I say. If it's important, factor it in. If it's not important, don't factor it in. Just make a conscious decision around the transaction as to what's important for you and what do you want to secure.
And I know that, you mentioned this gets asked of you a lot, and I want to make sure that I ask it. And I know that you've kind of told me your response a little bit, but I think it's good to walk through anybody who could be listening. You're talking mostly from an oil perspective, and that's usually what people are looking at because it's usually the easiest to find of mineral rights. But let's talk about like gold, precious gems, that kind of thing. If people are looking to have that incorporated into their purchase or sale, what's your kind of response to that?
Well, who's not looking for a gold mine, right? Usually that's going to be very state specific as to what is included in oil, gas, and other minerals. That's very case law, very state specific.
So this would be other mineral categories.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. It may be included in that, may not. You'll find that perhaps more in states like Nevada and places like that. You're not going to find that as much here in the Southeast. But, the other thing that people will ask about is, for example, gravel. Is gravel part of the mineral estate or not? That's, again, going to be very state specific, often not, but that's something that would be pretty important, maybe. Something that would need to be considered if there's a gravel deposit there. People tend to kind of know where the gravel deposits are, but that would be an area where you would certainly, if you're wanting the gravel, if there's a gravel deposit there, you'd want to explore that for sure,
Because if you open up your own quarry, those can be fairly valuable, right?
Yes, absolutely. And
go ahead, sorry.
It's part of the bundle of rights, timber, water. I mean, you're in some states, water rights are the most valuable thing you can have, right? Everyone focuses on what's important to them. They're not worried as much about oil and gas. They're worried about the water.
Oh, yeah. I know a lot of ranchers in our area where you can have like genealogical rights, right? Where the person above water from you can shut off your water until they had their fill. And
absolutely.
those are straight up breakup families.
And what priority you are in the water rights. So it's another one of the bundle of rights. It's all part of the negotiation. And I think what's fascinating to me is that people tend to focus on what they can see, and they don't focus on what they can't see. And as you correctly pointed out, Mac, there's a lot of value in things you can't see sometimes. And so you should make a conscious decision of what's important to you. And since land runs in perpetuity, I mean, how many investments you know out there that's going to run in perpetuity? Not much. There's only been 2 asset classes that I've researched that have run in perpetuity and been a currency of sorts, and that's gold and land. And gold doesn't produce anything, so that takes me to land, right? And so if you own land or minerals, that's going to go in perpetuity, thousands of years. So it's a valuable asset to own. And I think it's important to look at the whole bundle of rights as to what you're acquiring, why you want to own it, and what could be here. What's the possibilities of this property, not just today, but in the future.
So if I'm a landowner or I'm a prospective buyer, in this, looking at preserving my best interest, what is the single most important thing I can do to protect myself, making sure that and you mentioned doing your own research, but I'm thinking of somebody going out and getting a recreational tract or something like that, and just not knowing what they're getting a hold of. And maybe not being as dialed in to go do the research. Who do you reach out to? What do you want?
Well, so again, you can do it yourself. You can hire someone. I'll give you some resources a landowner can look at themselves. Every state generally has an oil and gas board. It's fascinating. You can go to those sites, and they will have plotted all the oil and gas wells that have been drilled in that state. There's a map. And you can go to that map, and some places you can press an icon and it'll show you the well log. Now, I can't interpret a well log, but it'll give you the results of that well log, right? And you can say, okay, there's been some activity here.
So you can see what went dry, or what holes were dry and what holes produced just from going to the state? Okay.
Yeah, you can go to the state oil and gas board. There may be an analysis of the well log, or there may just be raw data. If it's raw data, I can't tell much about that. But generally speaking, there's some comments about the well. If they plugged it, obviously, it was of no good, right? So
don't plug a good well, right?
No, generally not. So you would look at that and see what activity has happened in the area, right? So I do that on the properties I buy. I like to know, and it's surprising sometimes. Wells drilled in the 50s. Somebody will remember that in the area. It's amazing how much knowledge carries forward for a couple of generations. And the second thing you can do, if there are leasing in your area, this is fascinating. You can go to the same place, the property room, the record room in the county, and ask to see typically they have oil and gas leases in a different book. It's separate from the conveyances. They have an oil and gas lease book record, a room. You can pull the last book, the very last book, and see what leases have been secured, and you can see what terms the oil and gas companies paid for those leases. And that can be valuable to have, to see what is going on in the county in which your land is located. That's valuable because you can see what the royalty, landowners get a royalty, a share, a non-cost share of future production. Well, you want to see what has kind of been paid. What is the market for oil and gas, for royalty? The second thing a landowner would get in a lease is a bonus, an upfront payment. That can be pretty substantial. A royalty can kind of run between an eighth on the low side to as high as about a fourth. You won't often see a fourth unless you're in an area where there's been a lot of production, a lot of activity, but it can go as high as a fourth. An eighth is kind of the standard lease for very frontier, remote areas. Typically, you'll find something in between, and bonus will run all over the place. Cash bonus per acre. That varies depending upon the area, but you can find a lot of information just by going to the courthouse and seeing what the activity is and kind of what the going market terms are for an oil and gas lease in the county in which your land is located.
Yeah. So, and then just to make, I want to, again, make sure for anybody that is not familiar. So what this is saying is a drilling company, an oil company can come in and lease your land. And this is them saying, we'll do all the work. We just want to come onto your land, put a hole in the ground and pull the oil out. And then we'll pay you up front for the
granting of the lease.
So for the granting of the lease, we'll pay you up front. We'll give you a bulk sum of money, and then we'll give you 1/8 to 1/4% of the return from anything that we drill up after we get
the production.
It's kind of free money. I mean, I don't want to say free money, but this is work that you don't have to do, that they're doing on your behalf, that they'll pay you for.
Absolutely. So you get a royalty, a share of royalty. They will pay it periodically. And they do all the work. You're exactly right. The oil company takes all of the risk, and you share in the reward with the oil company based on the percentage of royalty you have reserved in your oil and gas lease. And so, if it's 1/8, you're going to get 1/8, and the oil company is going to get 7/8, right? And if it's a 1/4, you're going to get 1 out of 4 barrels, and they're going to get 3 out of 4 barrels if it's oil.
Right.
And then you take that, and it gets a little complex, but your acreage it contributes to a unit. The Oil and Gas Board will set a unit for the well. It might be 80 acres, might be 160 acres. If it's gas, it could be 640. I've seen some as big as 1,280 acres. And your track, as it pro rata to the greater size of the unit, and your royalty as it relates to the greater size unit, you will get a share of that income. So it's actually more ideal because you'll get a royalty rate based on a larger area that could have more oil and gas. So it's kind of interesting how that plays out.
So you could have a different split. So given if you're put into the same area, and I'm assuming that has to do with the reserve below ground, like if it goes across different boundaries. So you would be splitting some of those royalties with other landowners if they were tapped into the same area, right?
Well, they would have negotiated their own lease. If it's the same royalty, it would be pro rata to your acreage as it relates to the size of the unit. So if you had, let's just say, a 640 acre unit, 2 tracts with 320, and you both had the same royalty, it's no difference, right? But if you had 40 acres and someone else had 600 acres, you're going to get 40 over 640 as it relates to the production profile, and your royalty as it relates to the size of the unit as a whole.
Is there any sticking points as far as, you're basically putting a straw in the ground? Like what if 2 people are pulling out of the same bucket?
Well, that's the reason why you have units, and you have an oil and gas board that manages that. Absolutely. Yeah. You remember the old days when they had, wells almost stacked on each other? Yeah. Well, that's the reason why they passed oil and gas laws in each state, and they have oil and gas board that they have geologists on staff, and they kind of monitor that reservoir, and they allocate units, and you produce within that unit. So it's to avoid waste. And,
gotcha.
Yeah.
So, and I know that fracking has become a big thing, which is more in your shale areas, but where are the areas that, and so I think that in the Northwest, a lot of that is getting discovered now, especially in the Dakotas. That's kind of been found for a while, but they come across these from time to time in the Northwest, but you don't find a lot of the oil kind of style wells. Where would you say that people really need to pay attention to sort of like their land rights, other than everywhere? Because I think that the end answer is probably everywhere. But the ones that, the regions where people definitely need to be really dialed into their mineral rights.
Well, it's a hard question because, as you say, it's everywhere. You don't know where someone's going to drill in the future.
And everywhere is a perfectly fine answer. I just want
you don't know where someone's going to drill in the future. So, the future is where it's going to be valuable. I mean, it's not valuable if they don't drill on your land. But if they drill on your land, it's going to become pretty valuable to you. So I tell people it's important everywhere, but obviously, like I said earlier, and I said in the article that I wrote, if you're buying a piece of beach property, you're going to be focused on water access and view. If you're buying in the Permian Basin in Texas, you're not worried about anything but the mineral rights. People focus on what's at the forefront of their mind, right? Why am I buying this property? So the further you get away from a producing area, the less people focus on it, and perhaps they should give some consideration to it, because no one thought of the Williston Basin many years ago as being something that it has become, right? There are areas here in Mississippi that people had not considered before as having oil and gas potential. You see that in Alabama, right? Michigan, Pennsylvania, with the production there. So there are places where it wasn't given as much importance. There was in declining reserves. Oil and gas was of less activity. But with the shale boom, when they created this technology, that was kind of a game changer. So people went back to where they knew oil existed, or gas, and they started recommencing activities. And so I think it's important everywhere. It's just part of the deal. I mean, it's nothing to get over importance to, but it's something not to do without having given it some thought. If you're in an area where there is not a lot of oil and gas production,
and I think that's a really valuable point to bring up too. Is the fracking techniques were sort of brought into areas that had sort of been tapped out, right? And they found a new way of extraction that could make it more efficient and get that gas. So even if you think it your property might not hold, or even if you think it's done and tapped, there still might be new technologies out there that could utilize it. So definitely, again, going back to your answer, always pay attention to it regardless of where you are.
Well, it's like the guy that robbed the bank. Why are you robbing the bank? He said, well, that's where the money is, right? So oil and gas, people go back to where the oil and gas is. And that's where the focus is, because it's seen as less risk versus a frontier exploration, which is very high risk, but it's also very high reward, right? And so that's the reason why it's a difficult thing. So where should I focus? Well, there's going to be someone willing to take a risk in a new exploration trend, a new geological concept that previously had not been considered. And there's going to be others that go back to these highly productive areas and look at other horizons where they might want to explore. I mean, I'm not a geologist, but I saw that every day. They focused on where there had been previous production and retested concepts and ideas. And of course, seismic and the imaging of the subsurface improves with technological advances. I mean, they had 3D seismic, all of these different advantages where they saw things they had never before considered. So technology brings forward opportunity. And if you own minerals, you're going to own it in perpetuity. It's something to give some consideration to. I mean, I have seen sellers, if I'm representing the seller, he wants to reserve all the minerals. I'm not representing the buyer, and the buyer don't ask. And the seller was well willing to give half the minerals. It just wasn't asked for. You get what you negotiate in life.
You get what you negotiate.
You get what you negotiate, right?
Always be negotiating is what you're saying when it comes to the land.
You need to represent your interest and know why you're buying it, and know the full value that could be in the property as to what could happen in the future and why it's important to you. If it's not important, maybe you wouldn't put as much emphasis on it, but at least ask for it.
Well, I would say that this is it's a good lead into the exit on the conversation here, because I think that comes down to also make sure that you're working with the right professional when you're looking at buying or selling the land that is knowledgeable on these areas. And so Keith, I wanted to ask you, how would somebody get a hold of you, given this knowledge that you have, to make sure that they can make sure that they're on the up and up when they're buying or selling in your area?
Well, I'm always available. You can see my credentials on nationalland.com or my email, keithmorris@nationalland.com, and happy to help anyone. Again, you have resources locally through any local attorneys in the state you may be in. You can go to the property room in the county seat. These are, public employees. You're paying the taxes for their services. They can assist you. They're not going to run your title for you, but they can assist you on where you might look. And the Oil and Gas Board, which is often a state entity, they're not going to know whether you own minerals, but they can tell you what activity or direct you on how to see what activity has taken place in the area in which your land is located. But I guess my parting words would be live with intention in everything you do. And that would include buying and selling property, knowing what you want and going for what you require.
I think that's sage advice. Well, Keith, I can't thank you enough for your wealth of knowledge and the time that you have given here today. It is very much appreciated.
Thank you, Mac.
This concludes episode number 2 of the National Land Realty podcast, discussing mineral rights with one of our land professionals, Keith Morris, out of Oxford, Mississippi. You can learn more about land ownership or the buying and selling of land at nationalland.com.